It was the summer of 2003, and the Jazz Cafe in Camden Town was the kind of place that existed in a permanent twilight, smelling of old wood, cigarette smoke, and something that felt very close to history being made quietly. The room held maybe 200 people when it was full, and on most nights it filled easily because Camden was exactly the kind of neighborhood that understood small stages and big voices. The people who came to the Jazz Cafe didn't come for spectacle. They came because they believed, with a conviction that bordered on religion, that the best music in the world was happening in rooms exactly like this one. Rooms without screens, without production, without anything between the musician and the moment. The headliner that night was a British jazz trio that had been building a devoted following over the previous 2 years. Marcus Webb, the group's pianist and de facto leader, had a reputation that extended well beyond Camden. He had studied at the Guildhall School of Music, had performed at festivals across Europe, and carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent enough time mastering something difficult that he no longer felt the need to explain himself. He was not unkind exactly, but he had very fixed ideas about what jazz was and what it wasn't, and those fixed ideas had the unfortunate quality of making him rigid in moments that called for flexibility. The opening act that night was supposed to be a young singer named Clara Rowe, a 20-year-old from North London who played acoustic guitar and had a voice that her friends described as extraordinary, but that had not yet been described that way by anyone who mattered in the music industry. Clara had been given the slot as a favor. Her manager knew someone who knew someone, and she had spent the previous 3 weeks preparing for it with the intensity of someone who understood that opportunities like this one didn't come often. What no one had anticipated was that Clara Rowe would fall sick the afternoon of the show. Not the kind of sick that you push through, but the sudden, total kind. A fever that arrived like an announcement. By 6 in the evening, her manager was making calls in the corridor outside the venue trying to find a replacement, growing increasingly desperate as the time narrowed. Somewhere in that corridor, during one of those calls, a name came up. A 19-year-old who lived not far from there, who had been singing in pubs and small venues around Camden for the better part of a year, who had a reputation that was growing faster than her opportunities, someone whose voice people talked about in the particular hushed way that people talk about things they haven't quite processed yet. Her name was Amy Winehouse. She arrived at the Jazz Cafe at 7:15 with the casualness of someone who had not been urgently summoned, but had simply decided to show up. She was wearing a dress that was too big in the shoulders and boots that were slightly wrong for the weather, and she had the particular quality that some people have of filling a room not with noise but with presence, a gravitational shift that happened before she said a word. The manager explained the situation quickly. Clara was sick. The slot was 40 minutes starting at 8. There would be no sound check. There would be no time for preparation beyond what she already carried inside her. Amy nodded and said something like, "All right then," in the particular tone of someone for whom this situation was inconvenient but not frightening. Marcus Webb heard about the substitution approximately 20 minutes before showtime, and his reaction was one that people who were present in the backstage area would remember and describe differently depending on who was telling the story. Some would say he was dismissive. Others would say he was protective of the audience's experience in a way that came from a genuine place, even if it expressed itself badly. What everyone agreed on was that he walked into the small room where Amy was sitting quietly and told her, with the directness of someone who believed he was being helpful, that perhaps this wasn't the best setting for her. "This is a jazz audience," he said, meaning it as information, as a calibration, as a way of saying that the people on the other side of that wall expected something specific, and that a 19-year-old girl who had been playing pub circuit was perhaps not equipped to deliver it. They know what they're listening for. Amy looked at him for a moment without answering immediately. She had the quality, even then, of someone who processed things at her own pace, regardless of the tempo of the room around her. "So do I," she said finally, and turned back to the glass of water on the table in front of her. Webb stood in the doorway for another moment and then left. He went to find the venue manager and told him, with a conviction he clearly believed was justified, that putting this girl on before his group would damage the evening. He said the word amateur, not with cruelty but with precision, as though it were simply a category, a fact of taxonomy, something that had nothing to do with personal judgment. The venue manager, a man named Patrick, who had been running live music events in London for 15 years, and had developed the particular wisdom of someone who has watched enough nights go wrong to understand that sometimes the thing you're trying to prevent is the thing you most need to allow. Listened to Webb with the patience of someone who had heard many versions of this conversation. Then he told Webb, politely and without drama, that Amy Winehouse would be going on at 8 o'clock as scheduled. Webb went back to his corner of the backstage area with the expression of someone who had tried to prevent something he was certain would be unfortunate. At 8 o'clock, Patrick walked onto the small stage and introduced the evening's opening act with the brevity appropriate to that context. A name, a gesture toward the wings, a step back. Amy Winehouse walked out. The first thing the audience registered was not her voice, but her face. She had the quality, even in that context, of someone who had arrived somewhere she was supposed to be. Not nervous, not performing confidence, simply present in the specific way that makes an audience lean forward before a single note has been played. She sat on the stool at the center of the stage, adjusted the microphone with the familiarity of someone who had done it hundreds of times, and looked out at the room for a moment without speaking. Then she began to sing. What happened in the next few seconds was one of those moments that people who were present would spend the following years trying to describe accurately and finding that the language available to them was never quite sufficient. The sound that came out of Amy Winehouse was not what the audience had been preparing itself for. It was not the polished competence of a conservatory student. It was not the carefully constructed vulnerability of a singer-songwriter performing sincerity. It was something older and more specific, a sound that seemed to know things that sounds that age are not supposed to know, that carried in its lowest registers a kind of weight that takes most voices decades to develop, if they develop it at all. The Jazz Cafe went very quiet. Not the quiet of polite attention. The quiet of people who have stopped doing the things they were doing because something has demanded their complete focus. Conversations that had been continuing in the back of the room ended mid-sentence. The man at the bar who had been ordering a drink turned and stayed. Turned. The couple near the left wall who had been leaning toward each other in the particular way of people deep in a private conversation separated and faced the stage. Amy sang a standard, a song that the jazz audience knew, a song that had been sung by voices that had become monuments. She did not try to reproduce those monuments. She did not try to demonstrate that she had studied the history of the song. She simply sang it as though the song were happening to her right now, as though the emotion in it were not something she was performing, but something she was living through in real time, and that quality, that absolute refusal of artifice, was what made the room stop. Between the first and second song she said almost nothing. A small acknowledgement of the audience, a pause that was comfortable rather than anxious, the particular silence of someone who doesn't need to fill space with words because the music will do it. She sang for 35 minutes. In the backstage area, Marcus Webb had positioned himself near the monitor where he could hear the stage without being seen. He stood there for the first song with his arms crossed. By the second song, his arms had come down. By the third song, he had moved closer to the monitor without noticing that he had moved. The people who worked at the Jazz Cafe that night and who had seen enough performers come through to have developed a calibrated skepticism would describe his expression in the same terms, independently of one another. He looked like someone who was being shown something that contradicted what he thought he knew, and who was honest enough with himself to acknowledge the contradiction rather than ignore it. Amy Winehouse finished her set with a song that she had written herself, something that the audience hadn't heard before, something that sounded simultaneously like it came from another era and like it could have been written that morning. The last note she held for a moment longer than expected, and then it was gone. And the room was silent for the half-second that sometimes separates a performance from its response. Then the Jazz Cafe erupted. Not the measured appreciation of a jazz audience maintaining its sophistication. Something more unguarded than that. People were standing. The man at the bar was standing. The couple near the left wall were standing with their hands held in the air. Patrick, who had been watching from the side of the room with the practiced neutrality of someone who has seen thousands of performances and learned to modulate his reactions, was clapping with his hands above his head. Amy Winehouse stood, nodded once with the particular modesty of someone who is not surprised, but who is grateful, and walked off stage. In the corridor behind the stage, she almost walked directly into Marcus Webb. He was standing there in the way of someone who has been standing in a place waiting for something to happen, and is now not entirely sure what to do. He was a man who was careful with words. His training had given him precision in language as well as music, and so he understood the insufficiency of what he was about to say even before he said it. "I was wrong," he said, simple and direct, with the particular dignity of someone who has practiced honesty enough that it doesn't require theatrical presentation. Amy looked at him for a moment. She had the quality then, and she would have it for the rest of her life, of being entirely uninterested in triumph. She wasn't processing his words as a victory. She was simply receiving them. "What did you hear?" she asked him. Not with challenge, not with satisfaction, but with genuine curiosity. The question of a musician asking another musician what the music had communicated. Webb was quiet for a moment. "I heard someone who understood what she was singing about," he said finally. "Not technically, actually." Amy nodded, as though this were a reasonable thing to hear, and she was glad he had managed to find the words for it. What happened after that night is part of a story that the world knows. The conversations that began in the lobby of the jazz cafe, the people who asked Patrick who that girl was, the journalist who had been in the audience covering a different story entirely and who went home and made a phone call to an editor instead. The chain of small events that follow moments of genuine impact, the way ripples follow something dropped in still water. Within 6 months, Amy Winehouse had signed with Island Records. Within 2 years, her debut album had been released and had received the kind of reviews that make careers. Within 4 years, she had won more Grammy Awards in a single night than almost any British artist before her, standing on a stage that dwarfed the Jazz Café by every measurable dimension, singing with the same quality that had stopped a room of 200 people cold on a Tuesday night in Camden when she was 19 years old and someone had tried to tell her she didn't belong there. Marcus Webb gave an interview many years later in which he was asked about his early experiences with emerging artists. He talked about several, and then, unprompted, he mentioned a night at the Jazz Café in 2003 that he described simply as the night he understood the difference between training and truth. He didn't name himself as the one who had tried to stop her. He didn't need to. The story was not about his mistake. It was about what the mistake had failed to prevent. What Webb had not understood, standing in that backstage doorway telling a 19-year-old girl that this wasn't the right setting for her, was that the setting had nothing to do with it. The Jazz Café was the right setting because Amy Winehouse was in it. Any room she sang in became the right setting. That is not a quality that can be trained or studied or earned through the correct institutional affiliations. It is either present or it isn't. And no amount of expertise, however genuine and hard-won, can recognize it from the outside until the moment it makes itself known. The moment it made itself known in Camden that night, it made itself known completely. Years later, Patrick would be asked by a young journalist what the most memorable performance he had ever hosted at the Jazz Café had been. He didn't have to think about it. He described the night in precise detail. The sick opening act, the urgent phone calls, the girl who arrived at 7:15 in a dress that was too big in the shoulders, the way the room went quiet, the standing ovation from people who had come expecting something entirely different and received something they hadn't known they needed. She had already decided what she was, he said. Someone else trying to make that decision for her. It was never going to work. You can't stop a voice like that. You can only get out of the way or get left behind. What the Jazz Café held that night, in that room that smelled of old wood and something close to history, was not a beginning in the strict sense. The voice had always been there. The understanding had always been there. What the night held was simply the first moment that a room full of strangers got to encounter both, and recognize, in the instinctive way that humans recognize things that are genuinely rare, that they were in the presence of something that would not stay small, regardless of who tried to keep it there. Amy Winehouse walked back out to the main room after talking to Webb, ordered a drink at the bar with the ease of someone who has just done something ordinary, and spent the rest of the evening listening to the headlining trio perform. She listened with complete attention, with the generosity and curiosity of a musician who is always learning, always absorbing, always finding in other people's music something that feeds her own. When Marcus Webb sat down at the piano and began to play, she watched his hands. She didn't watch them with competition. She watched them the way she always watched musicians she respected, with the quiet hunger of someone who loves music too completely to be petty about where it comes from or who is playing it. That, perhaps more than the voice, more than the performance, more than the standing ovation, was the truest thing about her. The greatness was never in the refusal to be stopped. It was in what she carried that made stopping her impossible.